Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes or so where we talk about how we test the toolkit, and then about 20 minutes where we expect you to tell us how to do it better. And the last 5 minutes, I think, will just generally be testing your patience. So, to start off, the goals with how we test, and again, this is how we do testing of the toolkit code as a piece of software. As much as possible, we want it to be fully automated, have widespread coverage, and ideally easy to use, and even better, improve. Have I missed anything yet?
Nope.
Okay. Told you this was going to go quickly. So in the olden days, when we started out with the toolkit, we had a dedicated test team in IBM, which was great. IBM funded a team just to test this thing. But it was all manual, and it was not effective. And basically, they would run hundreds of builds with the release, and the next time we released, we'd run hundreds of builds again and compare the output. And if anything changed, they told me to figure it out and fix it. That was not efficient. It only ran at the end of the release process, and so everything you'd changed over the course of so many months would show up at that point, and it was difficult. And it's, yeah, lots of inefficiencies there. So, modern days, somewhat modern. We have a lot of Java code. Does anyone here use Java? A few people. Do you know what JUnit is? It's almost as many people. It's a way to automate testing of Java. Our early Java code did not use it. It was not written to enable tests, and so it's not really covered. In particular, chunking. I'm just hoping to get a rise out of Jarno there.
Well, yeah. all the unit tests have been written more or less by me, so there were no unit tests or automatable tests when I got involved with the project. And of course, it's easy when you have a testing team. It's difficult when you want to ship something and then you have to wait 2 weeks for them to test it first, and then you get feedback. And it doesn't work. It doesn't, well, we don't have to scale, but it would be nice to be able to release something without waiting for someone else for 2 weeks.
Yeah, one of the many ways it was inefficient, we'd basically finish development and then hand it off to the test team, and then we couldn't do anything for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, as they found time to test and generate a giant test report with lots of metrics, because I think many test teams are graded on how many metrics they can create. So it was a very big test report. Very impressive report. Xslt unit tests have been added more recently. Similar idea, test a function. If your code changes and the function no longer works, the test should catch it.
Yep. So again, it's been myself and Eero who's been adding these, and we don't do large-scale testing with the Xslt tests. So it's more or less still unit tests, but we test small functions that do a small thing, your normal unit tests, but still we're able to test the Xslt too, because we have a lot of that. So, question?
Are you using some equivalent of JUnit?
For testing Xslt, it's the Xspec. Yeah, so do we use any technology that is equivalent to JUnit? So the Xspec by Jenny Tennyson originally. So it's an easy way to test things. So I suggest everyone use it too on your own projects, since traditionally Xslt has been a bit of a black box. You stick content in and then something comes out and you hope it works, when in reality you could be testing individual blocks inside the individual functions. And with Xslt too, when you have functions, of course you had named templates and moded templates in previous versions of Xslt. We started to use this initially with functions, and it worked really nicely. Of course, most of the code isn't small individual templates or functions, but we're getting there. rather. We're not trying to convert everything into small blocks, but we're getting there that Xslt2 is testable at the unit level.
Yeah, I've started to run into this occasionally when I have tried to make updates to the Xslt and then these functions fail, and then I had to figure out what the XUnit functions actually did. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward when you look at it if you know Xslt, which you probably do if you're already in there changing Xslt. It generally just creates little tiny element trees and then passes those in as if they were the original source document and verifies that the result works. At least that's often the case. Integration test suite. This is when we take a bunch of data source and run it through to the end or nearly to the end or far enough to verify that a particular test has been successful. If it fails, then it might mean you made a code change and the code is bad. It might also mean you fixed something that you weren't aware of because our tests are not infallible, unfortunately. Or just generally, if you change something that is a reasonable change, it can have an impact on your test result that's reported as failure. I ran into that last year, I think, or maybe last spring, when we changed the default configuration, which previously the PDF and the HTML worked differently for setting the default locale. And so in some cases it was EN US, US English. Some places it was just EN, generic English. I changed it so that it was EN everywhere. That changed a lot of the integration tests because they had all previously defaulted to US English and then generated US English as their HTML language. And I had to fix quite a number of output files for that one tiny change. That is a problem in general with integration test suites. There's a lot of overlap. You know, pretty much every topic you have is going to have a topic element. And so if you change something basic about how topics are generated, it's going to hit every one of your integration tests. So as much as possible, those should be really targeted, really specific, and not overlap.
Yeah, so originally we got the integration test suite from IBM testers. It was more or less unorganized. They had batch scripts to run those tests. Didn't work on Mac. So we developed a way to run those using ANT scripts that do the work, and then just added functionality to compare the expected output to the actual output. The problem is, for example, PDFs are somewhat tricky to diff. It can be done, but it has to be automated. We can create a huge number of tests, but if they're not automated, then they're more or less useless. So you can't have a human doing that job. So right now, what most of the integration tests do is that they run only the pre-processing, and then we just know what the output should be and we diff it. There are some cases where we have generated IDs that, for example, Saxon creates. So the code that does the diffing will just actually strip those out. It has a regular expression pattern that recognizes Saxon's IDs. So we're able to sort of work around those. And then we diff XHTML, which is really annoying when you make a small change in the Xslt that generate XHTML, and then you have to change all the expected files because those changed. A lot of work. I at one point developed a simple way of testing PDF output by using FOP, outputting plain text. Okay, that loses all the formatting, but it would tell us whether blocks of content will disappear if something doesn't get processed anymore. So we won't be able to check that the styling is correct, but at least the content is there. Since for most people, if there's an error in the documentation, it's okay if it's not bold, but it's really not okay if a warning notice is missing and someone loses their head, like chops off.
Like actual loses their head, yes.
Actually loses their head. Those are always interesting.
But oddly, they never report it when that happens.
Yeah. So the integration tests currently are actually a JUnit test. It's a single JUnit test that runs all of those, so it's more than a minute test. I've been slowly progressing and refactoring that so that we're not using the AND drivers anymore that we used to have, but rather you configure the test in Java code and then you just run it. Less layers means simple system, and it's equally easy to add those. And if you're running the integration tests or the JUnit tests, it's just Gradle test and Gradle test integration test. Sorry, Gradle integration test. So running those is fairly simple too. Travis does it for us. So whenever you send a pull request, those tests are ran. The problem is that if someone introduces new functionality with their pull request, we would really like if the pull request came with new tests that verify that the new functionality works.
This is a little bit easier now because the integration test was previously a submodule, and if you've worked with Git submodules, you know that they make people cry. So now it's no longer a submodule. Fewer tiers equals good, I think, generally. The integration tests, as you mentioned, they came from original ones in IBM. That was actually sort of based on how I learned how to do integration testing when I joined IBM a long time ago. Yeah, 17 years, something like that. I was given a set of SGML files. I had to generate the HTML and then diff the output every time we had a patch, every time we had a release. And when I started that process, it would take 2 to 3 days just to do the comparisons, and that was a mind-numbing 2 to 3 days. So I made improvements over time, but that really led to, when we got the test team for the toolkit, I was doing testing the same way. They took it over, and it was out of my hands, so I didn't have to go crazy with that. But yeah, I also tended to just, whenever we had a problem report that indicated a new problem, that would go into the test, the regression test, integration test suite. Which again means there was a lot of overlapping function, because one giant book that had one little problem somewhere, the whole book went in, and you end up wasting a lot of time because there's a lot of stuff in there you're already testing.
Eero has been doing work with when he finds a bug in the issue tracker. When he verifies that it's an existing bug, he'll create a small test case in a specific repo that only contains test cases. And that's one way we use to verify that issues exist and they're reproducible. But of course, the guidelines for submitting issues is that please provide a simple test case that allows us to reproduce this without guessing or, well, coming up with examples, because it always takes time to reproduce the issue. And if it's faster, it's better for us. Of course, it takes your time, but then everyone's, yeah.
As you already mentioned, Travis CI, that's actually what does all of our building, testing. Every time somebody commits directly to the repository, it rebuilds and reruns our tests. Every time you submit a pull request, a suggested change, here's a code change I think you should make, or a new feature, it also runs the tests so that you know if your code change has introduced something. Something that we are testing and aware of. Of course, again, it's not completely covered. Any questions for us at this point? I see some people with hands on their forehead, which either means you need coffee or we have already tested your patience. In which case, it's time for you to ask us questions. Or wait, no. Sorry, I need coffee. Time for us to ask you questions. For the vendors in the audience, those who bundle and ship the toolkit, how do you test updates, or do you? Are there any that will admit to not testing?
I go for Robert. I think. Yeah, so we also have a bunch of automated DITA-OT tests on our side. They're more like Blackbox testing. So we take the data files, run the DITA-OT, look in the output folder and assert some of the HTML there or some of the generated XSLFO. If all works well, then I consider that the DITA-OT looks good, and then I commit it. Our tests, being Blackbox, take a long time, so sometimes I commit the new DITA-OT and leave the test overnight to run, and then I revert it in the morning if I have problems.
I think Jarno just cried a little bit. I was wrong about there not being any tears here.
The way Radu just described it, that's correct. That's one way of testing it. I'm just sad that it takes so long. And hopefully it's not too manual.
Yeah, I sometimes like Blackbox tests because sometimes you discover side effects that the test wasn't designed for, you know.
Yeah.
So I designed the test for something, but it catches another problem in the DITA-OT because it runs and generates all the HTML files.
Yes, we always like when you find other problems in the toolkit. Yeah, any other vendors do any testing of the toolkit when you update, assuming you update? Does anyone in the audience ship the toolkit and you're shipping 1.4 and you're never going to move? In which case, what are you doing here?
Well, I was just going to say that's...
I think you just lost the chance, Elliot, because someone else grabbed the mic. You need the mic. We'll go to Elliot next.
So we just take whatever the customer wants or the latest version. I'm with Eric Kunin with Astoria. We take the latest version or whatever the customer had wanted, and the way we integrate with it is that it doesn't matter what version is being used. So we'll ship a version of the Open Toolkit. We don't test it. It's not our code. We don't take, I hate to be, we got enough to test with our own stuff. To test your stuff, we're not going to test it. And and then when we upgrade around Astoria around it, we don't touch the Open Toolkit since it's not so tightly integrated that it has to be a certain version. So, and the customer can upgrade the Open Toolkit anytime they feel like they want to pay for the possible testing that's required to make sure the style sheets work or the plugins work. But that doesn't happen very often. Most customers like the version of the Open Toolkit they got, and they want to stay with it.
I was just going to say, for my clients, it seems like most of the products they use are either stuck on a specific version or they've stuck on a specific version because that's sort of where their customizations last fetched up. Or they're using DITA for publishers so they can't move past 185.
Right.
Yeah, I also have a question, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I speak from also some of my colleagues from Syncrosoft, from Oxygen. So we are wondering why, like Oxygen is kind of pushing 80% of the issues to the DITA Open Toolkit, and nobody else encounters any problem.
I have wondered that myself. And my assumption has been, right or wrong, my guess, is that a lot of those that get issues don't report them. They might not have, we have a connection here clearly, but other vendors may not feel that sort of connection and may say, this is somebody else's code. If you found a problem in it, you go report it. Whereas you have been reporting on behalf of the customers. That might be one option. I don't know.
Yes.
Well, I don't think it's that. If we have a problem where, and one of our guys is sort of dedicated to the Open Toolkit whenever there's issues, I think we report those bugs. We haven't found so many that we, like George, I don't know what he's doing, but, but when we find a problem, usually if there's something in the Open Toolkit, more often than not, we're not the only ones who have found it, and we suggest to the customer an upgrade, and they agree to it, and then we'll upgrade to the next version of it.
Makes sense.
We don't really find a tremendous number of bugs that require us to be as voluminous in our reporting as George does.
I think Oxygen, the developers there also tend to be sort of on the cutting edge of some of the newer features and really trying to do, I'll call them nice instead of crazy things with some of this new stuff. And you run into the edge cases there.
Probably.
That could be part of it as well. I do know of at least one case where I've heard of a vendor finding bugs fixing them in the copy that they ship to their clients and not telling us about it, so that their clients get the fixes and nobody else does, and we don't hear about it until you run into it, for example. But I don't want to name names on that.
Yeah, this is Jean-François from Xslt. So we also don't test the OT itself when it's integrated. So what's important for us is to make sure that the CMS is enabled for newer versions. So whenever there's a new version, we want to make sure that it can run into our infrastructure, so that and if we find problem, we with our infrastructure, because things have changed, libraries, jar files, whatever needed. So we make sure it's enabled. But it is a reality that most of our customers are lagging behind in terms of, so when they have issues because they found a problem with 1.8 or 1.6 and so by the time they move to a new version, the OT has moved to another new version. So so we don't really test the OT itself.
How much time is left, George? Okay.
6-7 minutes.
So to go back to Jarno's discussion of more integration testing, so I've developed a project on DITA community called DITA test cases that is not intended to be the sort of integration testing that Jarno does, but to be more tests of DITA features. That is, I'm writing test cases that test specific features of DITA and also explain how those features work so that I can understand what it's supposed to do and why the test isn't working. I use those tests myself to do regression testing of the Open Toolkit, but it's not automatable. That is, I'm doing the kind of thing that you talked about, but at a smaller scale, which is I run the test and then I inspect the result.
Yeah.
But I've written the tests so that the result tells you what the correct result should be, visually.
That's probably sort of in line with the test cases I mentioned earlier with localization, where it's overwhelmingly repetitive, which isn't good for an automated test.
Right.
But at the same time, it's useful as a one-off test, or it can be.
Yeah.
I've got a number of test cases like that as well that are all out there at that same place.
Mike Miller from Antenna House. Our interest is the PDF output, and we have developed a fully automated PDF diff system that we use to test our engine, and several customers use that also to test the PDF diffs. And it works with the PDF, finds all the differences, whether it's in type, shifting of pixels within the images within the PDFs, anywhere in the PDF, it'll find it. And it's fully automated. It does 10,000 pages in less than a half hour,
Right.
which is our test suite.
How difficult is it to validate the output? Like, is it like if you have minor changes in spacing that hit every PDF?
What the tool does is, first it does a checksum comparison. Checksums the same, PDFs are the
Right.
same. If there's a checksum difference, then it converts the PDFs to bitmaps and compares the pixels within the bitmaps. So it finds everything, colors, anything. I can demonstrate if anyone wants to see it. And I can take your order.
Right. So, of course, the last bit here is, we've sort of already gotten into that, some discussion, but what can we do better? As I said, that big integration test, that's how I learned to do things starting in '99, and that certainly wasn't the one and only best way to do it. That's been proven many times over. So it's definitely always learning here.
Yes. Youssef from Xslt, from SAP.
Yes.
My comment also on this is we are taking the same approach as described by Elliot. We have built a lot of test cases to cover each time we create new extension or we change the behavior on DITA Open Toolkit, and we combine also this each time we add a new language in our stack. So to check on the font support and all this exotic stuff. So the combination can be, in some cases, very scary. And we are now looking into automating this to have. So I would be more interested into to deep dive on this topic.
Yeah, in my own use in IBM, we're finally, we've been lagging behind on the toolkit. Some of you know the reasons. It's not really worth going into, but with the newer stuff we're doing, we're creating new test cases that basically, we have the toolkit with our plugins, and we run a bunch of tests through, assuming that the toolkit itself, with my other hat, has been tested relatively well. Our tests are of each of our specializations and each of our new output formats, and it's pretty much just a pass-fail. If the plugin wasn't integrated properly with the upgrade, then the new transform type is going to fail, or the new specialization is going to fail. So we've got a number of those, but not too much else. Anything else?
Radu.
When I fix an issue on the Oxygen side, maybe we have Jira and I fix an issue. If I don't commit a test case, we have a code review stage in which my issue is reopened. So in my opinion, if there is a pull request without a test case, that pull request doesn't matter for anything. It should be reopened, and you should have a test case for anything that you do, anything that you fix in the DITA-OT. That would be an ideal case. Of course, Jarno, you're doing this as a hobby. Also, I wouldn't make test cases. But
I think approaching the end here, I'll just end with this. Some of you may know the Swift on Security Twitter account. That's Taylor Swift writing about information security. Has an interesting thing. In our case, it really points out what can happen when we have, even up to 99% coverage. Right now we're so far from that, it's not even funny. But if we get to the 99% case, we still have issues. So I thought that seemed somehow relevant. So. Okay. I'll close that because it can be mind-numbing. You can not stop watching it. One of these times it's going to work.
It's supposed to do it.
Yes. Not so much information security as personal security.
I was discussing yesterday with Jarno about testing, and one interesting idea that we mentioned during that was FOP. Apache FOP has a table like all the specification functionality and whether they, the status of it's implemented or in progress or not yet implemented, things like that. And that will be interesting to link that maybe to some tests, that then you can get a coverage of what data functionality, let's say, is covered by the current tests. So, we cover chunking or not.
Right.
Or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
And the final, I think we can take the break for the last coffee break. But a final idea will be that I think we need to change a little the perception that DITA-OT is a third-party product. It's not my product, it's some other product. Because it's your product also, right? Just get involved. Thank you.
Yes.
And thank you, Jarno and Robert.